here, Rob McNeil, multi-screenwriting award winner. I and Rob will be talking about various aspects to screenwriting and writing as a whole. Novel writing, screenplay, screenwrite. A little more on Rob. Rob, would you like to talk a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. So I've been writing screenplays for over 5 years now. I've won several awards, and I've been to many festivals and have been, selected to festivals and have been finalists in different festivals, competitions, and contests. I've written about 14 feature screenplays and a pilot series and several shorts. And then I've also taught screenwriting before as well.
Rob and I have been working together for a couple of years here on Jacob Hollingsworth Network. We've got plenty of writings. We're almost up to 50 writings on Jacob Hollingsworth Network. A few of those featuring Rob himself. So today's iSchools event is kind of been a long time coming for us too. Glad we're finally able to get this done, and I'm ready to get this kicked off. After we get this kicked off, there will be a segment where any guests who are in the meeting will be able to ask questions. They can submit it via chat or come on mute and let us know what they're thinking. All right, let's get it started here. We're going to start with a concept that is very true to creating, essentially to creating all types of stories, but no matter what kind of story it is, and that is pacing. So let's get right into that.
Sure. So pacing as a screenplay is paced, and then how that kind of translates to the screen. Pacing is incredibly important because if it's too slow, you're either going to bore your reader or your audience or get them too bogged down into maybe some details that aren't necessary. Or if you're paced too quickly, then you're not really earning your moments towards the end. So what I wanted to talk about mostly here with pacing is that you should avoid writing a scene over 2 pages. The reason being is because, especially with a dialogue scene, if you have a scene that's over 2 pages, at that point, you're kind of overstaying your welcome. And like I said, you can really bog your reader or your audience down with too many details. The first 10 pages of your screenplay are arguably the most important. A lot of the time, industry professionals and other readers, if they read your first 10 and they're not into it, then they may just throw your script away. So I wanted to emphasize that the first 10 are exceedingly important. And what you want to introduce here is, so first of all, you have your attention getter. A lot of the time, people like to write a cold open, meaning that they have a scene before the title card even shows up, which will kind of be a preview of the ending to get you interested, and then it'll go back to the beginning. You don't necessarily have to start your script that way for a good attention getter, but it is what a lot of modern screenwriters have been doing in order to achieve that. So within that first 10, you want to establish the genre, first of all. So, what are we getting into? What's going to be the tone of it? What's going to be the theme of it? Obviously, you want to introduce your protagonist. Usually, you can kind of showcase their flaws or their quirks. That could kind of get a sort of relatability or a likability to your character. You want to be clear and concise with what you're doing from the start. Because again, you have to set all this up in 10 pages. So you don't want to get too complex, but you also want to have your character be deep enough for them to be interesting to your reader, to your audience. This is also the first impression that we're getting into the world, into the character, into the genre. So we want to make sure that we're making a good first impression. About the world building, we need to build out the specific details of the world. So what we can do here is we can cover up exposition by using visuals that are going to outline the backstory and the tone and the feel of the story. This is also where we can kind of hint at the theme. This is going to be the sort of underlying thing about the story that's going to drive it forward and keep everybody interested. We need to set up the dramatic situation. So obviously from the start, we need to know what's going to be propelling the story forward. And we need to build an excitement and intrigue. Typically within the first 10, we also need to show the day-to-day for our protagonist. So if we're not showing the day-to-day, we're not going to know, what's sort of the norm for our protagonist. And it's very important that we show the status quo, because once we reach the inciting incident, we need to get them out of the day-to-day. So that's going to be basically, we're going to need to shatter the status quo for our protagonist. And basically, it's the no going back thing. Once we've gotten them into the inciting incident, there's no going back to their normal life. So after the inciting incident, which usually happens around page 12, after that, we should have already established the emotional core of the story. So again, we need to be emotionally involved with our protagonist, typically by at least page 17, because if not, then we don't really have our reader or our audience, we don't really have them reeled in yet. And then usually by page 25, we should be wrapping up Act 1, and then we should be transitioning into Act 2 by around 30 or 33. That's typically what I do with my scripts, because I really don't like my scripts to be more than 90 or 100 pages. I know a lot of people love to just build to a sort of 120-page script, which is totally fine, because if you do the minute per page thing, that means that you're doing about a 2-hour movie. I personally don't care for my stories to be 2 hours or more. I usually shoot for 90 minutes, so that's why I like my scripts to be either 90 or 100 pages. But if you don't mind getting a little long and doing the 120 thing, that's fine. What I would recommend is to not go above 120, because you're getting into dangerous territory there. So next, what I wanted to talk about is the midpoint. So Act 2 is typically 55% of your script. I would argue that this is maybe the most important part of the script. As I was talking to Jacob about earlier, yes, it's important to have a start that's going to reel us in right away, but I think it's more important to keep us interested. And so the way to keep your reader or your audience interested is to keep ramping up the conflict in Act 2. And that's really where we get to the meat of the story. So if we have them reeled in by Act 1, that's great, but we got to keep them. And then we got to keep them until the end. And a lot of people argue that the ending is the most important part. That may be true, but I don't think that an ending can really make or break a screenplay. Obviously, it's equally as important, but I still think your Act 2 is still incredibly important, because we have to keep our reader or our audience interested. So by the midpoint, the protagonist should either be closer to or further from his or her goal. And there needs to be a really important shift in the story by the midpoint. So for instance, maybe your protagonist has the thing that they need to have in order to become the person that they're meant to be, but they haven't really sort of mastered that power yet. And that's where they'll do that in Act 3. But at the midpoint, they should have either reached it and haven't figured it out yet, or maybe they've gotten to a really important point at the midpoint, but then they failed, and so then they go to rock bottom. And that's a pretty common thing in storytelling, is you have a confrontation maybe at the midpoint, and then you have where the protagonist and maybe even the audience and the reader have lost all hope with the protagonist, and then they build themselves back up for Act 3. So that's why the midpoint is so important. I'm going to get to the climax now. So once we get into Act 3, like I said, after the midpoint, we might have a low point for the protagonist, and then that will be our sort of Act 2 transition into Act 3. Act 3 is about 20 to 25% of the screenplay, or like 25 to 30 pages long. The pre-climax should be about 10 pages. So this is kind of like I mentioned before, this is our protagonist sort of getting ready for the final act confrontation. And then once we do get the climax, that'll be about 10 to 15 pages roughly. And the climax ideally should be the culmination of all of the events, and then it should be the largest obstacle for our protagonist. The climax should occur at around page 90 to 95 or even 100, depending on how long your script is. So like I mentioned before, I like mine to be in that range. If yours is 120, then maybe this occurs at page 110. But that to me is kind of like uncharted territory because I don't like my scripts to be that long.
See, this is where Rob and I differ. I always tell him he's one of the most skilled writers I've ever known, and that's because he has everything formatted in this type of way to where it's like there is little room for error for him, and he's able to execute perfectly. For me, on the other hand, I do kind of go along with this pacing, with this kind of layout, but for me, it's more of how can I engage the reader in the first 10. I'm not necessarily thinking of that outline, but I'm actually following that outline without actually knowing that I'm following that outline. My favorite point here is the midpoint, where you're developing your characters to have dimensions and to have perspective and things like that. So next we are going to talk about developing a character, but I just wanted to add in there that Rob is one of the most skilled writers I have known. So if there's anything else you want to add on climax and resolution, please continue, Rob.
Thanks, Jacob. I appreciate that. And I guess going off of what you said there, I guess you don't necessarily have to have these moments at these exact page numbers. It's just a good sort of guide. It's a way to gauge where you're at. You don't need to follow that exactly, because I think if you did, you might be limiting yourself, but it's a good way to keep an eye on your pacing. I do want to emphasize, though, the 10-page thing, the first 10, as far as screenplays, that is incredibly important. Now, Jacob, it's going to be different for you with novel writing for sure, but I can't stress how important the first 10 are, because like I said, if you don't have an industry pro interested in your script after the first 10 or by the first 10, they're gonna toss your script in the trash. It's how it is. Like, whether that's right or whether that's wrong, it doesn't matter. That's how it is. So, and then once we get to these sort of later page numbers, it's not make or break, but it's going to be a good way to see, okay, where am I at in the story? Is this well paced? Is it going too fast? Am I going too slow? That's kind of what I'm trying to achieve here with outlining these page numbers. So
to get a little more specific, Rob, with your first 10,
Yeah.
how do you outline this? Are you outlining your first 10 pages as a thesis, or are you outlining it as a complete essay type of feel, or how are you outlining your first 10?
So here, let me pull up actually how I did it for No Return, which is my award winner. That one, basically it starts out, so you have a preview of the ending. So like I said, you can sort of have a preview of the ending to be your attention getter. Again, you don't have to do that, but that's just how I did it with No Return. That for me was page 1 to 3. And then after that, there's a flashback sequence, which is maybe a half a page or almost a page. And then I have my introduction of characters from 4 to 7. And then after that, you have the opening action sequence from 8 to 10. And then you have the inciting incident from 10 to 12. I kind of checked the boxes, so to speak. So I have my attention getter from 1 to 3. I have an introduction of characters 4 to 7. And then you have this action sequence that sort of builds out the world. It's going to showcase the theme and the tone of the script. And then, like I said, you should have your inciting incident by page 12, which I do. My inciting incident is 10 to 12. Basically, it sets up the mystery there. So the mystery is it's presented to the main character in a way that it says, yeah, so your wife is missing, and then boom, you're in it. So that obviously is not going to ring true for a drama or whatever genre your script is, but mine is it's a mystery crime thriller, and so that's definitely a good way to pace out and to structure a crime thriller or a mystery script.
Awesome, Rob. So speaking on that, it's kind of time to move into our next topic, which is developing.
Take it away.
When he was speaking about Midpoint, he spoke a lot about giving the character objective and giving them purpose. When you're working on your character, you want to make sure it has depth. You want to make sure it has a perspective. You want to make sure it has objective. You're working in that midpoint, like he spoke about. That's when your characters are starting to develop personality. They're starting to develop their dimensions. And if you have dimensionless characters, you are going to have a character who's relatable or who's able to take on a perspective. So if your character is unable to develop a perspective and unable to obtain an objective, then you have a character who's flat and who's unable to contribute to the storyline as a whole. So when you're working on that midpoint, you want to make sure you're working in between. And this goes along with pacing. That's why we did creating a character second, because when you're working on your pacing, your characters need to be able to relate to each other. They need to have substance. They need to have conversation. They need to have meaning. So when you're working on your pacing, you have to ask yourself why. Why is this character doing this? Why is this character asking these questions? Why is the character not asking these questions? Why is the character taking the action they've taken? So you really want to pay attention to what your character's objective is. Once you develop an objective, you can kind of figure out what kind of personality you want this character to develop. And that's going to develop a perspective for the character. So when you have your objective laid out, let's just say I was using an example earlier for a character who who was dehydrated, simply dehydrated. It's not about what you do, it's how you do it. I have a character who's dehydrated. He just went to bed the night before. He drank 3 bottles of water, okay? He slept the entire night through, and he's lying in bed. He wakes up the next morning, and he's still dehydrated, and he can't figure out why he's still dehydrated. He says, oh, I drank 3 bottles of water last night. Why am I still dehydrated? So he's lying in bed. He gets up. He says, hey, I'm dehydrated. I need to find some way to get some water. Now you have an objective, okay? You develop the perspective, and you develop the objective. Now, once you do that, you have to give the character a dimension. Giving a character dimension is about creating that personality, like I said. How does this character go about obtaining his objective? Is he clumsy? Is he careful? Is he confident? How's your character going about obtaining that objective? Which is quintessential, very important to developing a great cohesive story and working on your pacing for that specific reason. So when a character realizes that he's dehydrated, his objective is to go get that bottle of water out of the car, go get that pack of water out of the car. How does he go about this? Does he jog down the stairs? Does he leap? How does he go about obtaining his objective? That way, you've created a dimension for the character. Is he a lazy person? Is he someone who slouches down the stairs? He goes very mundane-like, and he's very slow, and he's not very excited about life. Or is he a character who's very excited and very energized, and everything he does, he's using his objective as his goal, as his endpoint. Different characters, like I said, have different objectives, go about obtaining their objective in different ways. So for a more slower character, I would focus more so on developing each aspect of that character in his slow moments. So with a slow character, I wouldn't have any character jump directly to the objective to begin with. But with a slower character, I would take my time a little more with detail in my writing. I would use more descriptive adjectives. I'd use more descriptive actions for the character to obtain its objective. With a more excited character, I would use more uplifting words. I would use more confidence building words to where it makes the reader excited about obtaining that objective, and to where you kind of want to go along that journey with that character to obtain his objective with you. Now you have a perspective for the character, and now the viewer has a perspective on the character. So once you develop a perspective on a character, you start to feel for that character. Once you start to feel for that character, you start to develop a relationship with that character. And this is someone you've never even met, someone you've never known, and you never will. But you understand this character because you start to relate to him, and for whatever reason that may be, because you focused on the detail of developing this character and giving him multiple dimensions to obtain his objective. So with that leads us to the next point of where we're going next, structure. Is that Rob? Are we going to structure next? Or
yeah. So what I wanted to dive into here as far as structure is, and now granted, we're maybe a little bit tired of hearing about the 3-act structure, but what I typically recommend to beginner screenwriters is you should master the 3-act structure first before you start to do anything else. So like, of course, we have people like Quentin Tarantino who play around with structure all the time. Jacob, you and I were talking about Pulp Fiction and how the broken narrative sort of revolutionized storytelling. Obviously, Pulp Fiction is a very extreme example because not a lot of people had ever played around with the broken narrative before. If they have, it wasn't nearly as popularized as it was with Quentin and Pulp Fiction. But I just want to say we're not Quentin yet, so we shouldn't really try out the broken narrative just yet. But it's a fun way to play around with story structure. The 3-act structure is your typical, it's the setup, it's the confrontation, and it's the climax. And of course the resolution. The Marvel Cinematic Universe uses the 3-act structure with very nearly every one of their films. If not all of them, it's the vast majority, probably 95%. And like I said, 3-act structure might be boring, it might be overused, it might be all that, but if we can master that, then we can start playing around with structure and having real fun. So the 3-act structure, as I mentioned, is setup, confrontation, and climax. Now the setup, here we set up the plot, the characters, the conflicts, and then, as I mentioned, we have the inciting incident, and then we have the first act transition into Act 2, where we start ramping up the conflict. Now in Act 2, we have the confrontation, which after the inciting incident, and after our transition and after the rising action, and of course the rising action is where we start to throw more obstacles in the way of our protagonist. This is where the protagonist perhaps confronts the antagonist for the first time, and they likely fail, and they fall into rock bottom. Now, Act 3 is the climax, where the protagonist typically overcomes their flaws to become the person they need to be in order to achieve what they want and or defeat the antagonist. So, again, and then the resolution is to tie up loose ends, and typically, especially if you're Marvel, you set up a sequel. Now, granted, like I said, this 3-act structure is perhaps boring, overused, cliche, blah, 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 but we need to master that before we get into the 4-act structure. Now, the 4-act structure is essentially the 3-act structure. However, Act 2 is divided into 2 acts. So Act 1, we have our setup, our exposition, introduction into key elements of the story. Act 2A is the events leading up to the midpoint, and the protagonist reacts to the inciting incident. So how do they respond to this? How does the protagonist respond to being taken outside of their status quo? Act 2B is where the protagonist struggle truly begins. They will face their problem head on, but will ultimately be defeated, more often than not. Act 3, or 4 in this case, is in the end the protagonist approaches the conflict with a renewed sense of purpose, and this is either an achievement or a failure of the goal. Now, this is ultimately dependent on what your story is. Of course, if it's an achievement, we have a happy ending, yay. Or if it's a failure, obviously this is more like a tragic ending or your bittersweet endings. Now, the 5-act structure is gets a little more complicated. Now, Melinda is probably familiar with this because I actually taught this in my screenwriting class at Heartland. There's a video about this, and it's on the Lessons from the Screenplay channel. He talks about how the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo movie, David Fincher talks about how they had to make their piece with a 5-act structure because the source material simply just didn't fit into a 3-act structure. So this video that Michael dives into, he basically shows that each act is basically a 3-act structure, but within 5 separate acts. So the key elements that are going to need to be in each of the 5 acts are a protagonist, an antagonist, an inciting incident, a desire or a journey, or well, both. And then you have your crisis, you have your climax, and you have your resolution. Now, each of those has to be in Act 1. That all those have to be in Act 2, in Act 3, 4, and 5. So it's very important to understand that each act is basically a mini movie within the movie. I will warn you about that video. If you haven't seen The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, it has spoilers for that.
So yeah, in regards to structure, again, it goes back to, and I mean, all of these things kind of line up with each other. You start with your pacing, okay? Then you work into your character, and now you have created an act, okay? So now you have all these things coming into play, and in order for all of these things to come into play, it needs to be cohesive, it needs to make sense, and in order for it to all make sense, you start with those fundamental aspects of pacing, then you move into your character, and then all of these can build into each act separately. So now, after you've created all of these components, you've recreated the incident in the second act. You've recreated the incident in the third act. You've given the character purpose. The character has dimensions. Essentially, and this is just theoretically, you can continue a writing forever until completion. You know, we see very often where it kind of seems like some writers kind of run out of gas in some instance. I'm not going to give any examples or anything like that, but you ever feel like you're watching a television show and it feels like after season 3, it's like, oh my goodness, another season. But you know, season 3 is usually the best season, and you wonder why, right? Because season 1, you've developed the character. Season 2, you've incited an incident, and all of these are actually within one season. But it actually, overall, if you look at the entire picture, it all comes full circle with the entire component of the show. Now, after that 3rd season, you have your climax. This is where everything comes full circle. Your character's been developed. All of your characters have been developed from season 1 and season 2. An incident has occurred in season 2 to cause the characters to develop a maturity level, or they learn something different about themselves and about others, and they're ready to take on a new horizon, a new adventure. Now in season 3, they're at their peak. They've reached their potential. Now it's time for the character to really amaze you and take you into places that you've never been. Season 4 is kind of that downturn to where you're finding your resolution to whatever's going on with your characters. It's where all your characters have kind of found themselves. They understand what their perspective is. They understand what their objective was. They've completed their objectives. Now it becomes sort of mundane, okay, after that season 4. But how do you reignite that? Well, you can reignite that by again, going back to focusing on, you just restart the cycle, focus on your pacing. Then you want to focus on your character development again. Then you want to focus on your acts again. So it all just comes full circle. And if you constantly care for each of those characters and you care about them understanding a new objective or taking on a new objective and understanding a new perspective about their life, about their mission, then you can essentially continue to write forever if you continue to give a new character objective and give them perspective and give them different dimension. So
another thing about season 2 is that typically this is where they really start to ramp up the conflict even more. You kind of dig your character deeper into a hole. The goal season by season typically, and granted this is different by genre, but I think it can ring true for any genre, and it's that you have to continue to make it worse for your character. So like the whole idea of if you're familiar with Save the Cat is you get the cat up into the tree, you throw rocks at it. At third, fourth seasons, whatever, that's when you're really throwing rocks at your character. You cannot make it easy on them, because again, if you have things going well for your character, there's no conflict, there's no drama, and you're not having your reader or your audience interested in it anymore, because they've essentially gotten what they wanted, and now we're getting comfortable, and maybe they fall back into the status quo. We can't have that. My favorite show of all time, Breaking Bad, each season it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse for Walt. And that's what we want. We want more conflict. We want to be more stressed out. Yeah, maybe give them a victory now and then, but it has to be a false victory. Right away, you undo that. You make it even worse for them somehow.
That moves into our next topic, actually, and that's where you find your identity for what you want your story to be about. And that goes back to where you're not making it easy on your characters. Okay, how are you not making it easy? Are you giving the character a obstacle that can easily be obtained, can easily be completed? Or are you developing a complication in this completion to where the character has to rediscover themselves? They have to re-understand who they are. And in order to do that, that goes back into the writer. What's the writer's mindset? What is the writer's general overtake when he created the story to begin with? What is the identity of this story? So that goes straight into our next topic, which is marketing of your story. You need to understand who you are as a writer. What is your goal for this story? What kind of place were you in when you were writing the story? What kind of narrative were you looking to create with this story? Who is your target audience? Who can you refer this writing to? You have to have all these in mind when you're creating a story. And when you're creating a story, so your story isn't going to be for everyone. That's just the law of the land. Everything isn't for everyone. But if you're creating a story with an identity and you know who your target audience is, you know who you want the story to be for, you know what kind of complications these types of people understand, you know what kind of complications you want your character to understand. All of these come full circle together. They all blend together to create a cohesive story because you understand who your target audience is and how many of these people can be reached through that portal of your target audience. That way, you have a vast majority of referrals from your initial target audience, and now you have a vast commercialization of your product to begin with, because now a lot of people are understanding what their friend understood and what you understood as a writer to begin with. Your characters had objective, they had perspective, and now you need a strategy to execute this story. Okay, how do you go about execution? How do you go about marketing your story? Okay, in order to market your story, you have to understand where again, who is your target audience? Where do you want to put this story? Okay, who are you going to market your writing to? Are you marketing to young adults? Are you marketing to adults, older adults? Are you marketing to coming of age type of stories, teens? Are you marketing to adolescents? who is your target audience? And that's where you have to understand what kind of source you're going to use to market your product. And that way you can kind of get a gauge on your target audience, your identity, and your identity starts to develop even more because you started to listen to, I advise to listen to your audience and see what they're liking in your story, what they're not liking. But you don't want to take all of this and you want to take it as a grain of salt per se. You don't want to have a bunch of opinions about your story direct the narrative of your story, because then it becomes fan fiction story. And you don't want that. You want the story to be authentic. You want it to come from you, but you do want to take those grains of salt and you want to understand who you're looking to market your product to, who's your target audience, and that way you've created a constant marketing stream to where your product has a great chance of success.
There are maybe certain avenues that might be better. Let's just say you wrote a feature script versus a pilot. Nowadays, these streamers are probably more of what you want to shoot for pilots and even features for that matter. Just because network television is more it's more of a specific market, and it kind of feels like those are more of the like writer's room type deals. If you have a pilot, I feel like nowadays your Netflixes of the world and your Amazons of the world are more likely to take a risk on it. If you have something that you feel is something that's more meant for a Netflix or an Amazon, you want to make sure that you look at what's successful. They always talk about you need to have comparables, but not just comparables. You have to have something that's successful. So like, I don't know, let's just say you wrote the next Queen's Gambit. You know, you want to make sure you mention that in your pitch. So like, you know, you're pitching to Netflix and you say, I have the next Queen's Gambit, but it's in this realm. And so that will definitely make their eyes light up. So again, positioning your script is all about, yes, you want to get into the nitty gritty of it, but from the start, you want to make sure, okay, know who you're pitching to. So like if you're pitching to Netflix, you mentioned the Queen's Gambit. If you're pitching to Amazon, you try to research like what's their stuff. And if you already know, you don't need to research. But with Amazon, you could be like, okay, this is like Marvelous Mrs. Maisel meets whatever. And so that makes their eyes perk up too, because they're like, oh shit, like the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is our most successful show that we have on Amazon. And so boom, you're in right there. So pitching is almost even more important than anything for your project.
All right, so that moves into our next subject, which is you've developed that strategy. You know exactly who you're going to market it to. You know exactly how you're going to pitch it. You know who your audience is. Now you're ready to move on a step further and try to get acclimated even more for the great project you've created. So let's get into award submissions.
Okay, so for submitting your project for awards, the most important thing is to get on to Film Freeway. Film Freeway is the, I don't want to say it's the only thing, but it's the biggest way to submit your work in this industry if you're a screenwriter. Awards, festivals, contests, and competitions that are going to be better suited to you and to your career. Mainly for screenwriters, it's going to be Austin Film Festival Screenwriting Competition, the Academy Nickel Fellowship. There are even Sundance Screenwriting Labs. The Nashville Film Festival Screenwriting Competition can be a big one. That's also Oscar eligible. You have the Atlanta Film Festival Screenwriting Competition. That's another big one. The one that I won about 4 years ago was the Cannes Screenplay Competition. They might be up and running again, but I know they shut down during COVID. So that I didn't submit that year, obviously, and well, neither did anyone. But those are going to be the ones that are going to be the ones to keep an eye out for. There are ones that are also specific to pilots. So, all those that I mentioned are mostly for feature screenplays. Some of them will be for shorts as well. But there are ones that are specifically suited to pilots. So you'll have like Stage 32 has some good ones, Screencraft. There are good ones out there, but I'm not super familiar with the pilot world. I only have one pilot, and I really haven't put it out into the world too much.
It goes into this topic right here of eligibility, where you really want to pay attention to what kind of submission you're submitting to. I used a joke a couple of days ago with Rob. If you're an American writer, you don't want to submit your writing for the Indian Award of the Year, the best writing of the year for India. So you want to make sure you're working along the category of what your writing is purposed for.
Exactly, and a lot of what is being pushed for is they're looking for diverse writers, and so obviously I wouldn't submit to that competition. But there's like diverse voices competition. There's female filmmaker competitions. There's other ones that are going to be better suited to others, and ones that I just have to ignore and go more towards my path. So it's like you said, it's more of the eligibility thing. It's just what's the proper avenue to take. So to get to the confidence piece, obviously being a writer, there's going to be this push and pull of confidence. You'll finish a script and be on top of the world and think that you're the greatest writer in the world. And then you get feedback, and then you're feeling like the worst writer in the world. And so there's always going to be that push and pull. But ultimately, what you have to do is keep on writing. You can sort of take the advice, the feedback that you get, cafeteria style. You can pick up the things that are going to help your writing, and then you leave out the ones that you don't think will benefit you. But ultimately, for you to gain confidence, and the confidence enough to submit, is going to be to submit to your peers, or to send them to your peers, get feedback, rewrite based on that. And of course, like I said, take it with a grain of salt. Take the ones that's going to help you and leave the rest. Once you've built up the confidence to know that your writing is going to be on par with the other writers in this competition, then go ahead and submit. Now, the tricky part about this is you have to write to deadlines. Now, as writers, we obviously hate deadlines, but a lot of these competitions have they have the early bird deadlines, and then they have the regular, they have the late, and then they have the super late, and then they have the holy shit, get your work in right now deadlines. So you kind of have to work to those. Obviously, everybody's going to go at their own pace. I always try to make the early deadlines because, of course, it's going to be cheaper to submit to those. So definitely try to make the early deadlines, but you don't want to force it. If you force it, then your work is probably going to be crap. If you don't mind spending an extra buck, then you can do the regular or the late deadlines. So just make sure that you're following the deadlines for these competitions. And as I mentioned before, if you're on Film Freeway is going to send you emails saying, hey, watch out for this deadline. This deadline's approaching, things like that. So it's going to help you. They really try to help you along, and they want to make sure that you're on track and everything. To get to this next bullet point, the calling card, really what you want as a writer is, I mean, of course, we all work for the accolades. We really want to build up a sort of resume that we can be proud of. That's going to take a lot of time. It's taken me 5 years to get to where I'm at, and I still feel like I'm as far away 5 years ago as today. So you really just have to, it's all about patience. If you're patient and you're hardworking, you can work through this grind. Enough festivals, you get your official selections. Maybe you even get a finalist or a semifinalist, quarterfinalist, whatever. Maybe even you'll win your occasional one. You just have to build up that calling card, and once you do, you can kind of have things to point to say, hey, I am a decorated writer and I belong.
Going on that goes along with the confidence, as well as you won't win every award. That just won't happen. But you have a calling card. You know exactly who you are as a writer, which goes back to that first 10 again, and goes back to just the overall writing you have. What's the identity of this writing? What's your calling card? And if you look at every award-winning script, whatever it may be, a good example I used when we were talking about a television show earlier, maybe a month or two ago, Rob, was Emily in Paris, and how people were kind of upset about that show and how it was nominated for so many awards. I told Rob that it's about relevance, and he completely agreed with me, and he's definitely understanding of that. Understanding the times you're in, understanding the season we're in, understanding the season, the society right now, and understanding how your writing fits within that fold. You don't want to, kind of mold yourself down into that. You want to kind of break free of that, but you want to understand what the parameters are. That way you're able to work around those parameters, work within them, and kind of just control what kind of writing you want to ultimately create. And now you have a calling card, and you're able to be identified. As soon as someone sees your name, you have an identity. People know exactly what kind of writer you are. They know what to expect when they see your work. A discussion we were having earlier is Christopher Nolan. He's able to bend your mind. You know you're going to get some mind bending when you watch a Christopher Nolan film in some way, some shape or form. And each director, each artist has a calling card. So as a writer, you want to look at yourself as an artist. You are an artist. You paint a picture. You have an image, and you expand that image, and you create a world. And now you understand what that world means. So that's where your calling card comes into play, where it's like, we know what to expect when we see your writing. We know what to feel when we see your writing. So that way we come into your writing with a perspective of what to expect with your film. Now with that, you don't want to go kind of overboard. You don't want to predict the season of the writing, which is the next bullet point here. It's the seasons of a writing. Different writings are fit more so for different types of seasons. I don't know if you ever noticed that, but there are winter episodes, there are summer episodes to a television show. There are summer films. Yeah. There are summer films. There are winter films. So you want to understand what the season is. You want to kind of get a feeling of what the market is asking for right now. And then you want to kind of work, like I said, around or within those parameters and dictate where you want to go with that. And understanding the season, you have your calling card and you're confident. That's how you're able to, feel very comfortable when you submit your writing for awards and things like that. Anything you want to add on that, Rob?
Yeah, I actually had a point I wanted to make based on your Emily in Paris note. So with that, we mentioned, it was up for a bunch of awards and there was some backlash perhaps about that. What I want to say to that is awards really aren't everything. It's nice, of course, to be a decorated writer and to have accolades, but ultimately all you have to really do is impress one person who can get things done for you. And so if your project doesn't have anything to it as far as awards or festivals or anything, just as long as that one person said yes to it and can get it made, ultimately that's all that really matters. But as far as if we are going to talk about award seasons and things like that, it's important to know what time of year you're in. So right now I'm writing to the Austin Film Festival Screenwriting Competition's early deadline, and I'm writing to the Academy Nickel Fellowship early deadline. Those deadlines are either coming up this month or they're about to pass. And I think maybe it's possible I may have already missed the Academy Nickel one, but I'll be able to make the regular deadline for that. But the early deadline for Austin is coming up at the end of this month. So again, it's important to know what season you're in. Right now, we're pretty much at the point where screenwriters really need to start thinking about submitting to the really important festivals and competitions. Now, if we fast forward 5 or 6 months, there will be early deadlines for some of the smaller festivals. So it's also important to know that. So like your Mammoth film festivals and your Beverly Hills film festivals, your Holly Shorts, and your things like that, those are going to be more towards the end of the year. Right now, we have the really important screenwriting competitions that have their deadlines coming up. So, and again, like I said, Film Freeway is going to remind you of that, but it's still important to know what time of year that you're in. So we're definitely not in award season, but we're in the time where we need to start thinking about it.
Cyrus novel is coming maybe within the next couple months or so. It probably will miss the major award categories for novel writing, but you know, like you said, it gives you time to submit those other avenues, those smaller festivals, those smaller competitions and things like that. But if you're out of your season for your writing, don't stop working on that writing. There's plenty of things you can do with the writing while you wait. You know, you can do book tours. You can do, go and surf social media and find different writers and, you know, kind of promote your work and things like that. Host different workshops and things like that. So your work is still being recognized before you're actually ready to submit it to the award, you know, competitions and things like that when it's actually ready, when it's actually time. So just because you're not in award season right up front, don't stop working on that writing. Keep working on it until you're able to get that in there and get that submitted.
Absolutely. You know, it might be, I mean, it's never too late, but sometimes it could be a little late if you kind of wait on the deadlines. So like, you're like, I'm going to wait to rewrite it until right before the deadline. It's like, oh boy, you know, you definitely want to have your rewrites being close to being finished, you know, by the time you hit the deadlines. So, you know, I mean, I'm guilty of that myself. I've been procrastinating on my rewrites until, you know, last month or even this month. So, you know, just always be working, always be writing, you know. It's important to have goalposts. It's important to have something to work.
Awesome. So we're going to open up for questions here pretty soon here, but let's talk a little bit more about Cyrus. Again, JHN exclusive Cyrus is coming out within the next few months here. You will be able to obtain it on any digital platform, Apple, whatever's your favorite, Apple, Amazon, what else is there? Barnes & Noble, Kindle, anything you have digitally, you'll be able to obtain it there. You'll also be able to obtain it through Jacob Hollingsworth Network at some point in time once it is released. Aside from the actual novel, there is merchandising for the novel. And please go and check it out. If you're not able to buy it this time, just go and check it out and see if you like what you see.
I'm excited to read it.
I'm excited. He's getting an exclusive pack, so he's a lucky guy here.
Yeah, I can't wait to read it.
So for questions and things like that, any questions you guys have for us?
Yeah, and I also want to let you guys know that you don't necessarily have to ask questions about structure or pacing or character and everything that we've talked about here. You can honestly ask questions about any aspect of screenwriting or novel writing.
So I did have a question when you guys were talking about marketing, as well as when you're submitting to those awards and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you try to, I imagine you would try to prepare, obviously, an elevator pitch for your script or for your novel?
Yeah.
And if you do prepare that, what is the structure that you put behind that? I know you talked about the identity of the script, the target audience, comparables, but what's kind of the structure that you use going into that elevator pitch?
So when I'm thinking about submitting any of my writings for anything, the first thing I take into perspective is my confidence level. How confident am I in this writing? I may be in my third redraft, I may be in my fourth redraft. So in order to get to that confidence level that I'm looking to obtain, I do various different redrafts, edits, and writes. So So my first draft was pretty much me getting my ideas out. And we discussed this earlier, Rob, where I'm have my ideas laid out and things like that. And now I'm starting to, you know, get the story completely together. Then my second round, I'm doing my editing. In my third round, I'm going back and I'm working on my pacing. And I understand exactly what my story is about. My fourth, I'm feeling pretty confident. I'm just filling in things here and there to understand completely, to make sure that when I'm able to present my story to anyone, that it's completely cohesive and it understands and it makes sense to me personally first. That way, when I'm working on my pitch, I pretty much I write my thesis. And I don't know if you do this too, Rob, but when I'm ready to pitch my work, shouldn't be more than 6 sentences. You need your introduction. You need three sentences that kind of give the writer an idea, or the whoever the audience is an idea of what your writing is going to be about. Then that final is going to be about wrapping that thesis together. Now, this is all based on the confidence that you had when you completed the complete drafting of your writing to begin with. Now I'm able to, when I'm asked, okay, what's my story about? Is this story ready to be submitted? I put that thesis in there and say, hey, this is exactly what my story is. I know exactly what my points are in this story. I know exactly why I wrote the story, and I know exactly what the objective is of the story. That way, when I'm able to present this writing, no one can say that, oh, I wasn't prepared to submit this writing, or I didn't have the confidence. So that's why I pretty much start when I'm working on submitting. That's my process. That's my complete strategy when I go into that.
As far as for screenwriting, what we have, so we do have like an elevator pitch, and what I mentioned before is like usually in an elevator pitch you do comparables, and what's most important is successful comparables. So do your research as far as that's concerned. So my elevator pitch for No Return is Gone Girl meets Chinatown with an LGBTQ plus twist. So Gone Girl is a massively successful hit. Chinatown, even if it didn't make a lot of box office, it was a huge Oscar hit. And then obviously I added the LGBTQ plus twist because that is socially relevant right now. Maybe not just right now, but possibly in the years to come as well. Now, so that's the elevator pitch. In screenwriting, we have what's called a log line. And the log line is basically the 1 to 2 sentence summary of what the plot synopsis is. So your log line typically is going to have, you need to have who your character is. You can have the setting, and then you have basically the setup and the main conflict for the plot. So log line for No Return is after being dismissed from the case of his wife's disappearance, a by-the-book detective goes rogue to uncover the events leading up to the day that she went missing. So right there you have sort of, I think that's just 1 sentence. So you don't want to go over 2 sentences. They say like 60 words-ish. But you want to keep the log line short as well.
Short to the point.
Yep, exactly. So you want to make sure that they're in after those 1 to 2 sentences. And so, of course, after the log line, you have your synopsis. Synopsis is usually 1 to 2 paragraphs. And then you also have what's called a treatment. And a treatment is basically 1 full page. I would hesitate to go to 2, but typically it's 1 full page. And basically the treatment is you run through the entire plot of your script, and you have to try to summarize it as best as you can into 1 full page. So those are kind of the main things that you have for your pitch. And then the other thing is a pitch deck. And in the pitch deck, you basically, it can be like a PowerPoint, and essentially you run through all of the major elements of your script. So you have character breakdowns, you have the plot synopsis, you have your comparables, you have the theme, you have the tone, you have visual comparables, you just have all these different aspects of your script that's basically going to show to whoever you're pitching to, whether it's producers, execs, what have you. You're basically showing with your pitch deck, this is all that encompasses my story. Here's why you should make it, and here's why it can be successful. It's going to be a hit, and why it's going to be relevant, and why you can, or how and why you can get millions of eyes on this thing if it's going to be on a Netflix or an Amazon or what have you. I hope that kind of answered it as far as screenplays or pilots, because that can, same sort of thing with a pilot too.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. Oh, hey. Yeah, I was wondering, can you submit spec scripts to? Are there competitions for spec scripts, or is that just for if you are trying to pursue representation to become a staff writer on a show?
Typically spec scripts. So are you referencing pilots or features?
For pilots for TV. Yeah.
Okay.
Television.
I would hesitate to submit a spec pilot for a competition because if you're writing towards a specific show, I guess I shouldn't say a spec pilot. I should say a spec script for a show. That's not going to win you anything because you're technically, I don't want to say plagiarizing, but you're technically drawing from an existing IP. So you definitely want to submit spec scripts for shows to either, like you said, representation or to like a writer's room if you're trying to get into a writer's room or whatever. Because that's where ultimately you're going to be showcasing your writing style and how you can benefit that show by being a part of that writer's room. Because that also shows, like, not only can you write towards these characters in this story in this particular show, but you can also bring your voice to it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I did have one more question, and I wonder if this is going to be different for both of you, or different answers for both of you. It'll be interesting to find out. But
Okay.
where would you find you do the most character development? Would you do that through dialogue or through action?
I think I would have tackled this first because I already know what I was going to say. But I think we
Go
kind
ahead.
of agree. We kind of agree that it's more so action. But it really depends on what type of writing you're going for. Are you going for more of an upbeat action, or are you going for a slower drama, romance? It depends. So we definitely want to focus on action no matter what it is, more so than the actual wording and the knowledge. Wording and the dialogue. We actually had to talk about another great film that that's pretty been winning some awards, and that's Coda. That film, we actually talked about how a lot of films that don't have any dialect at all, for the most part, or lack dialect for a lot of the film, tends to do pretty well because of the acting, and you have to look at different perspectives of film making. But that's going down a different rabbit hole of filmmaking and things like that. But even when you're writing, for me, I use a lot of narrative speaking in a novel, to where I'm not having the character speak as much. I'm letting their movements and my adjectives speak for them. So whether, like I said earlier, whether he's slowly going down the stairs or he's upbeat going down the stairs, what's his personality? Is he a lazy type of character? Is he a more confident type of character? So all of those things I take into account when I'm creating the dialogue of how much is this character supposed to speak, how little is this character supposed to speak in this dialogue. So I'm very careful about making sure I maintain my dimensions on each character, to where they're speaking when they absolutely necessarily need to, and they're not speaking when they don't need to speak. So we don't need mundane lines that are just causing, the audience to be annoyed in a sense. And that happens with a lot of characters. You find yourself getting annoyed by this character. Like, why is this character here? Well, that's the reason. They have a lot of lines that you just don't see an objective in. You don't see their dimension. You don't see why they're there. And you really want to pay attention to why is this character there? Why are they speaking? What can they contribute to this scene? What can they contribute to the story? How about you, Rob?
I pretty much agree with what you just said. What I will say is if you are going to have your character reveal something about them through dialogue, just make sure it's subtextual. I mean, if you want to have them say something really on the nose by the end of it, it needs to be like a really character defining moment. So like, so for example, you know, a lot of the time we see in shows and in movies that characters tend to be more reserved and they don't really speak out. And then by the end of it, you know, as a part of their character arc, they finally stand up for themselves and they're just like, I've had it. I'm going to speak my mind finally. And so, you know, it's a big moment for them because they're actually coming out and saying things. So, and the reason I want to harp on subtext so much is because people often don't say what they mean. They sugarcoat things. They beat around the bush. They fake politeness. They have sort of implied accusations. People are passive aggressive. People employ sarcasm. People mask the truth. People soften the blow. And people put off arguments by bringing up another thing. Or
We
another
discussed this. We discussed this, Rob, and how I think it was. I'm not going to say which film it was, but I was pretty annoyed when I was watching the film. I think it was maybe November or October, where you know they're directly giving you what the objective is for the character. Subtext. You don't want to just flat out just say what the objective is for the character. You know that goes back to the pacing and the character development. You don't want to just jump right into it. You want to make sure there's subtext around. There's like he said, some people beat around the bush. Some people are more upfront, but they're still not going to give you the direct plot right there and there. So you want to be very careful with that. You want to let the story develop itself in a sense where each character's personality is building together this dialogue, and not their words that are building the dialogue, but their personalities and their intentions are building the dialogue to create an objective.
Dialogue should do one of three things. I mean, ideally it should do all three at once, but it should move the plot forward, it should be the revelation of new information, or it should build or develop or reveal character. It should do those three things either all at once or at least one of the three in each of those lines of dialogue. Now, the other thing that dialogue must be is it must be unique to the character. So this character must speak this way, so you have to keep it consistent throughout the whole story. And like I mentioned before, you could still have that character who's reserved in the beginning, and then by the end of it, they finally are more outspoken and they speak for themselves. I actually watched a video on the movie Collateral starring Jamie Foxx, and his character was almost exactly that. He was a little bit more reserved. He sort of faked his way, you know, he faked it till he made it. And by the midpoint, he actually started to mimic Tom Cruise's character a bit. So he started to be more confident in himself. He started to stand up for himself more. And he was even saying exact lines that Tom Cruise's character was saying. So that was a big, and it literally happened at the midpoint, which, you know, again, we're going full circle there. But, and that was a character defining moment for him. So it's just important that if we're ever going to have dialogue, you know, speak for the character, or, you know, like if we're going to have it be dialogue instead of action, you know, showing rather than telling. If we have to tell, then it needs to be something like that. It needs to be important, it needs to be significant, and it needs to be compelling.
All right. Any more questions?
Questions?
That's a great answer.
No, thanks. You have something?
Oh no, I was just gonna say thank you too.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Well, all right then. I guess that pretty much brings us to the end of this High Schools event. Also, like I said, back to this. Check out some of the merchandise on Jacob Hollingsworth Network for Cyrus already there. JHN exclusive labeled mugs. I've got some mugs here. And also, I've got bags which are manually ordered, but I still got some here, and they're limited edition, so we want to get these right away. All right, so check out the website and check that all out. And anything else, Rob?
Yeah, I do have one more thing I wanted to say before we went. If you guys had any questions, or if you have questions that you think of later, after we're done here, that you meant to ask, don't hesitate to either reach out to me or reach out to Jacob.
For whoever will be watching this later at a later date and recording, this is Hollingsworth Network Corporation, and the Night Schools event is completely done. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rob, for being here and giving us your great insight. Thank you, Melinda and Kendall, for showing up to the web shop. All right, thank you guys. Bye-bye.
All right, you too.